Welcome to Scary Reddit Stories Volume 2 from Scary Stories Vault. The Story 1, Whispering Pines Motel. From account, Scott Walker. They say some places have a memory, a way of holding on to things, like a sponge soaking up the past. The Whispering Pines Motel off Route 66 is one of those places. It was supposed to be a simple road trip from Los Angeles to Chicago. Just me, my old Honda, and the endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the heart of America. My plan was to stop at various landmarks along the way, soak in the sights, and maybe get a few good stories to tell back home. The journey was smooth until I hit the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. A sudden downpour forced me to pull over, and that's when I saw it, the faded sign of the Whispering Pines Motel. It wasn't part of the plan to stay there, but the rain was coming down hard and my eyes were getting heavy. The motel looked like it hadn't seen a guest in years. The neon sign flickered weakly, barely illuminating the cracked pavement leading up to the office. I figured it was a classic case of you get what you pay for, but all I needed was a bed for the night. The office smelled like stale cigarettes and old wood. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with a stoic expression. Her skin was wrinkled and pale, almost as if it had never seen sunlight. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Yeah, just one night," I replied, handing over my credit card. She eyed it suspiciously before handing me an old-fashioned key attached to a piece of plastic with the number 7 etched on it. "Room 7. Breakfast is at 8, she muttered, not that I planned on sticking around for breakfast. I trudged through the rain to my room. The corridor was lined with doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in ages. Each room had a small, dusty window with curtains drawn tight. Room 7 was no different. The room was quaint. The kind of quaint that makes you feel like you've stepped back into the 1970s. A faded floral bedspread, wood-paneled walls, and a boxy TV that probably only picked up static. The musty smell was overpowering, but I was too tired to care. I kicked off my shoes, laid down on the bed, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind or the old pipes, but then it became clearer, more distinct. It sounded like someone was speaking directly into my ear, but the words were unintelligible like a foreign language or some ancient dialect. I shot up from the bed, heart pounding. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. Just the dim light from the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I shook it off as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. But the whispering continued. It was soft at first, then grew louder, more insistent. The next morning, I woke up groggy and unsettled. The whispering had faded sometime during the night, and I managed to get a few hours of restless sleep. I decided to skip breakfast and get back on the road. As I was packing my things, I noticed something odd. A thin layer of dust had settled on everything. My clothes, my suitcase, even the bedspread. It was like the room had been abandoned for years, yet I had only slept there for a few hours. I went to the front desk to check out, but the old woman was nowhere to be seen. The office was dark, the air inside colder than I remembered. On the counter was a guest book, its pages yellowed with age. Out of curiosity, I flipped through it. The last entry was from 1987. Confused, I scanned the names, looking for any sign that someone had stayed there recently, but the pages were blank. I grabbed my key and left it on the counter, eager to get out of there. As I walked to my car, I noticed something even stranger. The other rooms, the ones with the curtains drawn tight, had signs of life. Shadows moved behind the windows, fleeting shapes that darted out of sight as soon as I looked. My skin prickled with unease. I jumped into my car and started the engine, glancing at the motel one last time. That's when I saw it. A face in the window of room 7, pale and gaunt, watching me. I drove for hours, trying to shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached a diner a few towns over, I pulled in and ordered a coffee, my hands still shaking. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed my unease. "Long night?" she asked, setting the cup in front of me. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stopped at some motel up the road. Whispering Pines, I think it was called." Her face paled. Whispering Pines. That place closed down years ago. My stomach dropped. "No, it's still open. I stayed there last night." She shook her head slowly. "That can't be. There was a fire back in '87. Burned the whole place down. They say it's haunted. People have seen lights, heard voices, but no one stayed there since." My mind raced. The guest book, the dust, the whispers, none of it made sense. I left the diner in a daze, needing to know if what she said was true. Against my better judgment, I drove back to the motel. The rain had stopped, and the sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. I pulled up to where the motel should have been, but there was nothing there, just a charred foundation and a rusted sign, half buried in the ground. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like jelly. The ground was covered in ash and debris, the remnants of what had once been a building. I walked around, kicking at the rubble, trying to find any sign of the room I had stayed in, but there was nothing, just blackened wood and twisted metal. That's when I saw it. My room key, lying in the ashes. The plastic tag with the number 7 was partially melted, but it was unmistakable. I picked it up, my hands trembling. As I turned it over, I noticed something etched into the back. Words scratched into the plastic, barely legible. "Don't listen to the whispers." Panic set in. I dropped the key and stumbled back to my car, desperate to get away. As I fumbled with the door handle, I heard it again, the whispering. It was louder now, coming from all around me, a cacophony of voices speaking in that strange, unintelligible language. I slammed the car door shut and locked it, my heart racing. The whispering grew louder, filling the car, pressing in on me from all sides. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, echoing, repeating the same phrase over and over. "We are the lost. We are the forgotten." I started the car and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and ash. The whispering followed me, growing fainter the further I got from the motel, but it never completely disappeared. It was as if the voices were inside my mind now, a part of me. I drove straight through to Chicago, not stopping once. When I finally arrived, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, to convince myself it was just a nightmare or some kind of hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But the whispers, they never left. Weeks passed, and I started hearing them in my apartment in the middle of the night. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, then louder, more insistent. I began to see shadows out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when I turned to look. I did some research, trying to find any information about the Whispering Pines Motel. I found old news articles about the fire in '87, about how the motel had been a hotspot for strange occurrences even before it burned down. Guests reported hearing voices, seeing apparitions, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Some said the motel was built on cursed land, others believed it was a gateway to another realm, but no one knew for sure. One night, as I was sitting in my living room, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their haunting chorus. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, growing louder and louder and louder until they reached a crescendo. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. I slowly uncovered my ears, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a single clear voice. "You shouldn't have listened." The room grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There, standing in the doorway, was the old woman from the motel. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and translucent. "You let them in," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Now they will never leave." I blinked, and she was gone, leaving me alone in the silent room. The whispers started again, faint and distant, like a radio signal tuning in and out. I knew then that I was never alone, that they would always be with me, whispering, watching, waiting. I tried to go on with my life, but the motel had left its mark on me. I moved to a new city, changed my name, tried to start fresh, but it was no use. The whispers followed me wherever I went, growing louder each day. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you ever find yourself on Route 66, near the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona, and you see a faded sign for the Whispering Pines Motel, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't listen, because once you do, they will find you, and they will never let you go. The Story 2, The Echoes of Route 66. From account, Jake Anderson, 87. They say Route 66 holds many secrets, but some roads are better left unexplored. In the summer of 1997, I was a fresh college graduate, full of dreams and eager for adventure. My best friend, Alex, and I decided to take a road trip across the country, a rite of passage for many young Americans. Our route? The legendary Route 66. We had no set destination, just a plan to drive from Chicago to Santa Monica, soaking in the sights and stories of the open road. We'd heard all the classic tales of Route 66, quirky roadside diners, the Cadillac Ranch, and ghost towns left behind by the March of Progress, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered on a desolate stretch in New Mexico. Somewhere between Tucumcari and Santa Rosa, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt. The car's engine hummed steadily, and the landscape around us grew increasingly barren. We passed a rusted sign that read, "Welcome to Cibola County," though there wasn't much to welcome us. The air turned heavy, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel just a little off. But we were too busy enjoying the thrill of the open road to notice the subtle shift in atmosphere. As night fell, the stars came out in a brilliant display, far from any city lights. We decided to pull over and set up camp for the night, far enough from the main road to avoid any late-night traffic. It was just us and the desert, an expanse of nothingness that felt both liberating and slightly unnerving. We set up our tent and started a small campfire, laughing and reminiscing about college days. It was around midnight when we first heard it, a distant humming sound, like a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Alex noticed it first, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, straining to catch the source of the noise. It was faint, almost like the echo of a machine far off in the distance. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind or some distant highway construction. But then it grew louder. We tried to go to sleep, but the humming persisted, growing closer and more intense. It was an unsettling sound, one that seemed to crawl under your skin and set your nerves on edge. Around 2, we were jolted awake by a sudden flash of light. It was blinding, filling the entire tent with an unnatural glow. We scrambled out, thinking it might be a car or perhaps a search helicopter. But the sky was clear, and there was no sign of any vehicle. The light was coming from the ground, illuminating a narrow path leading away from the road into the desert. Against our better judgment, curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to follow it. With flashlights in hand, we walked cautiously along the glowing path. The desert around us was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under our boots. The path led us to an old, dilapidated gas station, one that hadn't seen a customer in decades. Its sign creaked in the breeze, reading "Last Stop" in faded, peeling letters. The place was a relic, a ghost from another time. We should have turned back right then, but something compelled us to push forward. Inside, the station was a snapshot of the past. Rusted gas pumps, a dusty countertop, and a broken-down car out front. But it was the smell that hit us first. An overwhelming scent of decay, like something long dead. We cautiously stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like a mix of old motor oil and something darker. Then we saw it in the back room, a figure hunched over. It was a man, or what used to be a man, his clothes tattered and skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring straight ahead as if he was in some kind of trance. In his hands, he held an old radio, the source of the humming sound that had haunted us all night. Alex and I froze, our breath caught in our throats. The man suddenly jerked his head toward us, his mouth opening in a grotesque smile. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry leaves. "They come every night." Before we could react, the radio in his hands crackled to life, emitting a series of distorted voices and static. The air around us grew colder, and the lights flickered. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to shake, and a low rumble filled the room. The man started laughing, a high-pitched cackle that echoed in the small space. Then we saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, moving with unnatural speed and precision. They had no faces, just hollow voids where eyes and mouths should have been. They surrounded us, their presence suffocating and oppressive. We ran, adrenaline fueling our every step as we bolted back to the car. We didn't look back, too terrified of what might be following. The engine roared to life, and we sped down Route 66, the road a blur beneath us. The humming sound faded into the distance, but it never truly left us. For years, Alex and I never spoke of that night. We went our separate ways, trying to bury the memory in the depths of our minds. But every now and then, I hear it again, the faint humming, like a distant echo that never quite fades. I moved to the East Coast, far from Route 66, hoping to escape whatever it was we encountered that night. But the memories linger. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I see those shadowy figures in the corner of my eye, just waiting for the right moment to return. And the man's words haunt me to this day. "They're coming," he said, and I believe him, because some roads, once traveled, never truly let you go. I tried researching that gas station to see if anyone else had encountered it, but there was nothing. It was as if it never existed, but I know what I saw, and I know that, somewhere, in the vastness of the American desert, the echoes of Route 66 still call out to those brave, or foolish, enough to listen. The Story 3, The Whispers of Body. From Account, Body Haunter 85. They say the ghost town of Body is cursed, but no one ever tells you what happens when the sun goes down. It was the summer of 2011, and I was on a cross-country road trip with my girlfriend Emily. We were the type of couple who thrived on adventure, the kind who would rather spend a night under the stars than in a 5-star hotel. So, when we heard about Body, a real-life ghost town nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, we knew we had to check it out. Body was once a booming gold mining town in the late 1800s, but was abandoned almost overnight when the gold ran dry. Now it stood as a state historic park, preserved in a state of arrested decay. We arrived in the late afternoon, just in time to catch a ranger-led tour of the old town. As we walked through the eerily quiet streets, it felt like we were stepping back in time. The buildings, though weathered and worn, still stood with a kind of haunting dignity. Dust-covered windows offered glimpses into the past, with tables set for meals that were never eaten and shops stocked with goods that would never be sold. Emily was fascinated, snapping photos and reading every plaque, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a strange unease settled over me. The ranger wrapped up the tour with a warning. "We close the gates at sunset. I suggest you head out before then. Body has a way of holding on to those who stay too long." It was a chilling way to end the tour, and though I laughed it off at the time, a part of me wondered if there was some truth to the ranger's words. We decided to spend the night at a nearby campground, just a short drive from Body. As we set up our tent and built a small fire, we couldn't stop talking about the ghost town. There was something undeniably captivating about it, something that made you want to explore every inch of its dusty streets. But as the night wore on, our conversation turned to the stories we had heard about Body. Tales of miners who had lost their minds, of shootouts in the saloon, and of spirits that roamed the town long after the living had left. "I don't know," Emily said, staring into the flames. "There's just something about that place. It's like you can still feel all the energy, all the lives that were lived there." I nodded but didn't say anything. I felt it too, that strange, almost magnetic pull. It was as if Body was calling to us, inviting us to return. As the fire died down, we crawled into the tent and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the ranger's warning, about the way the shadows had seemed to move just a little too quickly in the fading light. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but as I lay there, I realized it was something else. It was faint, almost like a murmur, but I could make out distinct voices. They were speaking in hushed tones, like they were trying not to be heard. "Emily," I whispered, nudging her awake. "Do you hear that?" She groggily sat up and listened. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from outside the tent, from the direction of Body. We exchanged a glance, our hearts pounding in unison. "Maybe it's just some other campers messing around," Emily suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "No, it's coming from the town." We unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The whispering was still there, clearer now, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. It sent a chill down my spine. "We should go back," Emily said. But there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes, the same curiosity in her eyes, the same curiosity that had brought us to Body in the first place. I nodded, more out of a desire to end the unsettling noise than anything else. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking back toward the town. The whispering grew louder with each step, guiding us like an invisible force. The gates to Body were locked, as expected, but that didn't deter us. We climbed over the fence and made our way into the heart of the ghost town. The streets were empty, but the whispering was everywhere. It seemed to be coming from the buildings themselves, from the very walls and floors of the old structures. "Do you think it's some kind of prank?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper itself. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that we were being drawn towards something that was both terrifying and irresistible. We walked past the saloon, the schoolhouse, the church. The whispering was louder now, almost like a roar in my ears, and then we saw it. In the center of the town square stood a figure, a man dressed in old-fashioned mining clothes. His back was to us, and he was standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, like a statue. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's go," she said, her voice breaking. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the figure. And then, slowly, he turned to face us. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light around them. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and his skin was a sickly, rotting gray. I felt my blood run cold, my heart slamming against my ribs. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and stare. But I was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of this ghastly figure. Emily was pulling at my arm, trying to drag me away, but it was like my feet were glued to the ground. The figure took a step toward us, and then another. The whispering reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that filled the air and drowned out all other sound. "We need to go now," Emily screamed, yanking me with all her strength. Finally, I broke free from whatever spell I was under, and we turned and ran. We sprinted back through the town, the whispering following us like a living thing. I could feel it on my skin, in my ears, in my very bones. We scrambled over the fence and didn't stop running until we were back at our campsite. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. The whispering had stopped, but the memory of it lingered, a dark stain on our minds. We packed up our things in record time and drove away, leaving Body far behind. We didn't speak a word the entire drive back to civilization. What could we say? How could we explain what we had seen, what we had heard? For weeks after, I was haunted by nightmares. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispering echoing in my ears. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, those hollow eyes staring into my soul. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a product of our overactive imaginations. But deep down, I knew better. Body had shown us something that night, something dark and terrible that should have remained buried. We never went back. We never talked about it, not really. It was an unspoken agreement between us that some things are better left unsaid. But every now and then, I'll hear a faint whisper in the dead of night, and I'll wonder if Body is still calling to us, still waiting for us to return. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe Body really does have a way of holding on to those who stay too long. Either way, I know one thing for sure. Some places are meant to be forgotten, because the past never really dies. It just waits, patient and silent, for the right moment to reach out and pull you back in. The Story 4. The Shadows of Waverly Hills. From account, Waverly Whisperer 76. You know, they say some places are so haunted that even the ghosts are afraid to stay there. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one of those places. In the fall of 2014, I was working as a freelance journalist, mostly covering local events and human interest stories around Louisville, Kentucky. I had heard about the Waverly Hills Sanatorium from various ghost hunting shows and friends who loved a good scare, but I had never really given it much thought. That is, until my editor suggested I do a piece on it. Something for the Halloween season, a spooky, in-depth look at one of the most haunted places in America. I was skeptical, to say the least. I'm not one to buy into ghost stories or haunted house cliches, but I figured it would make for an interesting read at the very least. Plus, it was an excuse to check out a piece of local history. Waverly Hills was a tuberculosis hospital back in the early 1900s, and thousands of patients had died there during the TB epidemic. The place had a reputation not just for its grim history, but for the paranormal activity that people claimed to experience there. I managed to get permission to spend the night there, something they usually reserved for paranormal investigators and the occasional brave tourist. My friend Sam, who had a morbid fascination with all things creepy, agreed to come along. He was thrilled at the idea of ghost hunting in such a notorious spot. I, on the other hand, was more interested in capturing the atmosphere of the place, maybe catching a glimpse of what made people so uneasy about it. We arrived at Waverly Hills just before sunset. The massive Gothic-style building loomed over us, its windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of a skull. The place was surrounded by a thick forest, adding to the sense of isolation. It was easy to see how it got its reputation. Even in broad daylight, there was something unsettling about it. We met with the caretaker, an older man named Jim, who had been looking after the property for years. He gave us a brief tour, explaining the history of the place and pointing out some of the hot spots where people claimed to have seen or heard things. There was the morgue, the body chute, a tunnel where they used to transport the dead, and of course, the infamous room 502, where 2 nurses supposedly took their own lives. "People say this place has a way of playing tricks on you," Jim said as we stood in the hallway outside room 502. "You might see something out of the corner of your eye, hear a voice when no one's there. The mind can do funny things when it's scared." I nodded, taking notes and trying to focus on the story rather than the chill that was starting to creep into my bones. Sam, meanwhile, was snapping photos and looking around with wide-eyed excitement. "Think we'll see anything tonight?" he asked Jim. Jim shrugged. "Who knows? Just remember, sometimes it's better not to see." With that cryptic warning, he left us to our own devices. We set up our gear in what used to be the main lobby. I had my notepad, a voice recorder, and a flashlight. Sam had brought along an EMF detector and a thermal camera, the kind of stuff you see on those ghost hunting shows. We decided to start our exploration on the top floor and work our way down. As we walked through the darkened hallways, the air grew colder and the silence became almost oppressive. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, and every so often I'd hear a faint creak or a distant thud, like the building was settling, or maybe like something was moving just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered at one point, stopping in his tracks. I listened. Nothing. Just the faint rustling of the wind outside and the low hum of the building's ancient electrical system. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. We continued on, making our way to the solarium, where the patients used to take in the fresh air. It was a long, narrow room with large windows that overlooked the forest. The glass was fogged up, and the room felt colder than the rest of the building. Sam took out his thermal camera and started scanning the room. "Getting any readings?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nothing unusual." "Wait." He paused, staring at the screen. "There's a cold spot over by the window." I walked over to where he was pointing, shining my flashlight into the corner. There was nothing there, just an empty space where the light seemed to dim, like it was being absorbed by something. "Probably just a draft," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. But then I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in a visible puff of mist, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was a sense of being watched, of something standing right behind me. "Let's keep moving," I said quickly, turning away from the window. We made our way to the morgue, where the bodies of the deceased were stored before being taken down the body chute. The metal tables were still there, rusted and stained with age. The room had a distinct metallic smell, like old blood and disinfectant. Sam set up the EMF detector on one of the tables and turned it on. The device beeped softly, the lights flickering in a steady rhythm. We stood there in silence, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, I started to feel foolish. We were standing in an old abandoned hospital, jumping at shadows and waiting for ghosts that probably didn't exist. "Maybe this was a mistake," I said, half joking. But then the EMF detector spiked, the lights flashing red, and the device emitting a loud, high-pitched beep. We both jumped, staring at the device in shock. "Is that supposed to happen?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sam didn't answer. He was staring at something over my shoulder, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man dressed in a long, dark coat. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his eyes. Dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching us. I felt a surge of panic, every instinct screaming at me to run. but I was frozen, unable to look away from those eyes. "Jim?" Sam called out, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" No response. The figure remained silent and still, like a statue, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next he had vanished, leaving nothing but the lingering sense of dread. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, finally finding my voice. Sam shook his head, his face ashen. I don't know." We stood there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. My rational mind wanted to explain it away. Maybe it was a trick of the light or our imaginations playing tricks on us, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. We decided to head back to the lobby and regroup. But as we turned to leave the morgue, the door slammed shut on its own. We both jumped, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. "Okay, I've had enough," I said, my voice shaking. "Let's get the hell out of here." Sam nodded, his face pale. We hurried back down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. But as we reached the staircase, we heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. I glanced at Sam, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face drained of color. "Yeah, we need to go now." We practically ran down the stairs, the moaning growing louder and more intense with each step. It was like the building itself was alive, like it was trying to swallow us whole. We burst into the lobby, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Where's the caretaker?" I asked, looking around frantically. But Jim was nowhere to be found. The front door was open, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faintest whisper of that moaning sound. We didn't waste any time. We ran out of the building and didn't stop until we were back at the car. We jumped in and peeled out of there, leaving Waverly Hills behind us in the rearview mirror. We didn't talk on the drive back to town. What was there to say? We had seen something in that place, something that defied explanation. I tried to tell myself it was just our imaginations, that we had let the stories and the atmosphere get to us, but deep down, I knew better. For weeks after, I had nightmares about Waverly Hills. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that moaning echoing in my ears. I tried to write the article to make sense of what we had experienced, but every time I sat down to type, the words wouldn't come. It was like something was holding me back, like the place itself didn't want its story to be told. Eventually, I gave up on the article. Some stories are better left untold, I decided. Waverly Hills had shown us something that night, something dark and terrifying that wasn't meant for the living. And though I try to put it out of my mind, I can't shake the feeling that a part of us never really left that place. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up and think I hear that moaning again, the low, guttural sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And I'll wonder if Waverly Hills is still out there, waiting for its next visitor, its next victim. Because some places are haunted not just by the dead, but by the living as well. And once you've seen what we saw, you realize that some shadows can never be escaped. The Story 5, The Shadows of Lake Lanier. From Account. Lanier Echoes 13. They say the past is buried deep beneath Lake Lanier, but some things refuse to stay submerged. It was the summer of 2003, the kind of humid Georgia summer where the air feels thick enough to choke on. I had just moved to Gainesville, Georgia, for a new job, and everyone in town raved about Lake Lanier. It was the go, to spot for boating, fishing, and just escaping the heat. But every time someone mentioned it, there was this strange look in their eyes, like they were trying to say something they couldn't quite put into words. My friend, Mark, was one of those people. He was a local, born and raised in Gainesville, and he'd been trying to get me out on the lake since I'd moved there. "You haven't really lived here until you've spent a day on Lake Lanier," he'd say with a grin. "But be careful. The lake has a way of swallowing things whole." I laughed it off, chalking it up to local lore and superstition. I wasn't much of a believer in ghost stories or curses, just a guy looking for a bit of adventure, so when Mark suggested we spend the weekend camping by the lake, I agreed without hesitation. We packed up our gear, loaded his truck, and headed out on a Friday afternoon. The drive to the lake was beautiful, with winding roads cutting through dense forests and small towns that seemed frozen in time. When we arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting a warm orange glow over the water. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. We set up camp at a spot near the lake's edge, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Mark had brought his fishing gear, so we decided to try our luck before it got too dark. We cast our lines, and for a while, it was just the two of us, sitting in silence, watching the water ripple with each passing breeze. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an eerie feeling settled over the lake. The air grew cooler, and a thick fog began to roll in from the water, creeping towards us like a living thing. It was odd, almost unnatural, how quickly it enveloped us. I glanced over at Mark, expecting him to make a joke or reassure me, but he was staring out at the water, his face pale and tense. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the lake. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze, squinting through the thickening fog. At first, I saw nothing but the dark, murky water, but then, as the fog shifted, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beneath the surface. It was quick, like a shadow darting across the lake floor, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Probably just a fish," I said, though even I didn't believe my own words. Mark didn't respond. He just kept watching the water, his grip on the fishing rod tightening. Minutes passed, and the fog grew thicker, the world around us fading into a gray haze. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. Something wasn't right. We decided to call it a night and head back to the tent. As we walked away from the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was an oppressive sensation, like eyes boring into the back of my skull. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing by the water's edge. But there was nothing, just the dark expanse of the lake and the thick veil of fog. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence was too complete, the kind that presses in on you from all sides. I lay there staring up at the tent's roof, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Mark was already asleep, or at least he seemed to be. But I could tell he was uneasy too. His breathing was shallow and quick, like he was on edge even in his sleep. Around 2 AM, I was finally starting to drift off when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic splashing coming from the direction of the lake. At first, I thought it was just the water lapping against the shore, but then it grew louder, more insistent, like something was moving through the water with purpose. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark," I whispered, shaking his shoulder, "do you hear that?" He stirred, groaning softly as he woke. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Listen," I said, my voice trembling. We both sat there in the darkness, straining to hear. The splashing continued, growing louder and closer. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but in the water. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the sound reached the shore, then stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from just outside the tent, we heard a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." Mark and I froze, our eyes locked in mutual terror. The voice was so close, almost as if it was right outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. We waited, not daring to move or breathe. "Did you hear that?" I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "We need to see what it is," he whispered back, though I could hear the fear in his voice. I wanted to protest, to say that we should just stay put and wait for morning. But something about the voice, that desperate, pleading tone compelled me to act. Slowly, we unzipped the tent and peered out into the night. The fog had grown so thick that we could barely see a few feet in front of us. The air was deathly cold, and the lake was eerily still, like a sheet of black glass. There was no sign of anyone or anything outside. "Hello?" Mark called out cautiously. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the direction of the lake, the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." It was a woman's voice, filled with a deep, agonizing sorrow. We exchanged a glance, then grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the tent. We walked toward the lake, the fog swirling around us like a living entity. The voice grew more insistent, drawing us closer to the water's edge. As we reached the shore, the fog parted just enough for us to see a figure standing waist deep in the lake. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, hanging over her face like a veil. Her clothes were old-fashioned, soaked and clinging to her thin frame. She looked up at us, and for a moment I thought I saw her eyes. Hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light right out of the world. "Please," she said, her voice echoing across the water. "You have to help me." My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in her gaze. Mark took a step forward, his face a mask of horror and pity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, as if considering the question. Before we could react, the fog surged forward, enveloping her. She vanished into the mist, leaving only the echo of her voice behind. The fog twisted and writhed, taking on strange, contorted shapes that seemed to dance on the water's surface. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissipated, leaving the lake calm and empty once more. Mark and I stood there, staring at the spot where the woman had been. The air was still, the only sound the faint rustling of the leaves in the breeze. We backed away slowly, our flashlights flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we packed up and left, driving away from Lake Lanier as fast as we could. We didn't speak about what we'd seen, not for a long time. But the memory of that night haunted me, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected times. Years later, I did some research on Lake Lanier, hoping to find some explanation for what we encountered. What I found was a history of tragedy and loss. The lake was man-made, created by flooding the old towns of Oscarville and other communities. Cemeteries, homes, and roads were submerged, and with them, countless lives and stories lost to the depths. There were rumors, of course, stories of ghostly apparitions, mysterious drownings, and strange lights seen over the water at night, but no one could explain the voices, the shadows that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. Even now, I can hear her voice in my dreams, that desperate plea for help echoing in the darkness. Sometimes, I wonder if she was a remnant of those who were buried beneath the water, trapped in a limbo between the past and the present, or perhaps she was something else entirely, something that should have never been disturbed. Lake Lanier holds its secrets well, and whatever we saw that night, I know one thing for certain: some things are better left buried, because once you awaken them, they never truly go away.